is Lauren Hughes, and I am the PBIS coach at Prudence Crandall Elementary School. Over the last 4 weeks, I've been creating videos with different strategies to help manage any behaviors that you may be having at home. The focus of this week's video is going to be on the why behind misbehavior, also known as the function of the behavior. This simply means that all behaviors, whether they're good or bad, serve some sort of purpose. Someone's either trying to get something or avoid something. So why is it so important to understand the why behind or the function of your child's behavior? It's a really important first step in deciding how you as the adult interacts when your child does misbehave, as well as helping you determine some positive or proactive steps that you can put in place to hopefully make that misbehavior pointless. If you don't know why they're doing what they're doing, then you might accidentally be reinforcing that behavior just by your response. So hopefully after watching this week's video, you can observe your child and try to understand what they are gaining by misbehaving. Then in next week's video, I'm going to get into how you can respond more appropriately depending on what the function or what they're gaining from misbehaving. Before I move on with the rest of this video, there's one thing I want everybody to keep in mind, that through research and the science of behavior, no child is born with bad behavior. So I know this might be a very hard pill for some people to swallow, but inevitably by the end of this video, I hope you see that all behavior does indeed serve a purpose, and it's not something that they are innately born with. So for this video, I'm going to give you a very basic, really Reader's Digest version of how to figure out why your kid is misbehaving, so hopefully you can start to begin to dabble into that and look at what your child's misbehavior is trying to tell you. So the first thing to understand is that all behaviors are either to get or obtain something or to escape/avoid something. So your child could be trying to get adult attention, so that can be any adult in the household, grandma, mom, dad, aunt, uncle, foster parent, you name it. Or they could be trying to get peer attention. That could be a sibling, that could be friends, anybody that's close in age to them. They could also be trying to obtain an activity or a tangible item. This activity could be something, an electronic game, this could be a game outside, this could be any activity that they enjoy doing, that they're trying to get access to. So when we think of a tangible item that they might be trying to get, that's more like food related or a toy or a present, maybe a sticker. So those are all tangible items they might be trying to get. Or they could be trying to get sensory stimulation. This is really most common in children on the autism spectrum, or if they have some sort of sensory processing disorder, where they would have help from an occupational therapist on different strategies to give them that sensory input. But for other kids who maybe have a difficult time focusing or sitting still for a long period of time, that sensory stimulation that they could be looking for could be as simple as getting up and taking a walk, or maybe they need to do some jumping jacks. So just some way of getting that movement out of their body in a more appropriate way so they don't feel that they have to act out to get that. Or they could be trying to avoid either some adult attention, maybe they are around somebody they don't really like, maybe they're trying to avoid their sibling, or they could be trying to escape or avoid any aversive activity. So something they don't like doing, homework, reading, going to a practice they don't enjoy, or any of this distance learning, they could be trying to avoid that as well. Or they could be trying to avoid that sensory stimulation. So sometimes it might be too loud in the household, or there's some obnoxious noise that's happening that they're really trying to get away from, so they act out to do that. So this brings us to, how on earth do we figure out which one of these is the reasons why my kid is acting out? So in order to figure this out, we have to go through the ABCs of behavior, what we like to call it in behavior world. So this simply means you have to look at what happens immediately before that behavior happens, which is known as either the antecedent or trigger. And then we have to look at what is happening immediately after that behavior, which is known as the consequence. So when I say consequence, most people assume that is some sort of punitive punishment type thing that happens immediately following that behavior. That is definitely not the case. A consequence could actually be anything good or bad that happens right after that behavior. And sometimes what we might think is that punishment could actually be reinforcing. So let's go through a few examples that I've heard from different parents within the district, friends of mine with kids at home, so we can kind of see what going through those ABCs of behavior looks like. So let's start with our first example. So let's say your child is at the kitchen table doing their math and they begin banging on the table and swearing. You as the adult go over and send them to their room for being inappropriate, and they never have to go back and do the math work. So in this example, the antecedent or trigger in this is the math assignment. The behavior that the child showed was swearing and banging, and their consequence was that they got out of their work. So for this example, the function or reason behind why they were misbehaving was that they wanted to avoid the math assignment. And based on the response by the adult, the child actually completely achieved their goal of not having to do that math work because they were just sent to their room and they were never expected to go back and finish that. So inevitably, this child is probably more likely to do that behavior again because it worked this time for them not having to do the math work. So for example number 2, you're on the phone with your friend and your child is jumping up and down in front of you and screaming your name while you're on the phone. You've already asked them calmly once to wait till you're done with the phone and find something else to do. Your calm redirection does not stop the behavior, and your child continues to do this behavior of jumping in front of you and yelling your name while you're on the phone. You end up telling your friend that you have to go, you get off the phone, and you give your child a 10-minute lecture about how disrespectful their behavior was and that you're very disappointed in them. So in this example, the antecedent or trigger was that your child was getting none of your attention because you were on the phone with somebody else. The behavior was that they were jumping up and down in front of you and screaming your name. And the consequence was that you ended up getting off the phone and you had a lecture with your child. So for this example, the function of that child's behavior or reason why they were doing it was to get your attention. So for some kids, this might be enough. Just doing the lecture and telling them that you were disappointed by their behavior may be enough for them to not repeat that again. But if you begin to see this as a pattern anytime that you're on the phone, this is because your child desperately wants your attention and does not like the fact that you're on the phone, not paying attention to them. So inevitably, by you giving them that lecture after the fact, they did get your undivided attention in that moment. So it will probably encourage that jumping up and down and yelling your name behavior in the future. So for our third example, let's say your child really wants to play Minecraft on the iPad, and they just keep repeatedly asking you, even though you've said no each time. They continue whining and yelling that it's not fair, and because you're so frustrated and done hearing this conversation and having your kid whine and repeatedly ask you, you just cave and say, fine, you can play for 10 minutes. So for this example, the antecedent or trigger is that your child could not play on the iPad. So because of that, they started to repeatedly whine and ask you to play even though you had already said no. And then inevitably the consequence, even though it took a few times, was that they did gain access to the iPad. So the function of this child's behavior was to get access to that iPad and to be able to play that game. So again, as I've stated in my previous videos, this is not judging anyone who may have caved when their kid has repeatedly asked them to get on the iPad. I get it. It gets frustrating to have your kid keep asking and whining for the same thing over and over. But if you're starting to notice this becoming a pattern at your household where your child just keeps repeatedly asking more and more so, knowing that eventually you're going to give in because you don't want to hear it, you might actually just be making this whining increase each time because they assume that eventually you're going to give it to them if they do that behavior. So this is why whenever you're going through these ABCs of behavior to try and figure out why your kid might be acting this way, it's important to look at it over time and to look at a bunch of different scenarios and not just one isolated event. This is because the behavior that your child exhibits might look different over time in different incidences. Sometimes they might be crying and throwing a fit. Sometimes they might argue with you. Sometimes they might go into complete shutdown mode. But as the adult, really paying attention to what happened right before that antecedent or trigger and what happened immediately following or the consequence can really give you an idea of what they're gaining from this or the reason behind why they're behaving that way. Because even though the behaviors might look different each time, a lot of times the behavior is really serving the same purpose and the same function each time. So these are just a few examples that I've heard through the grapevine that you might be encountering at home that I thought would be pretty relatable to go through these steps of how to figure out the reason why behind what your kid's misbehavior. So for next week's video, I'm really going to focus on showing you how, based on what the function of your child's misbehavior is, how you can intervene earlier and put in different strategies proactively before this misbehavior even happens, as well as how to respond most effectively after the behavior has happened so we aren't accidentally giving the child what they want and rewarding them. So for this week, I would just take the time and go through these ABCs of what is happening, what is that trigger right immediately before the behavior happens, and what are you doing right after. Don't worry about making any changes, just kind of observe what you do and how you handle it, and then that will give you some insight into more of what your child is gaining by misbehaving. So as always, I am here to help. Please feel free to reach out to me via email that I will leave on the last slide of this video. I hope everybody has a fun and relaxing long Memorial Day weekend.